Chapter 1. If Maitland Ferguson had known what was going to happen to his son later that night, then he would never have spent their last 5 minutes together before bed reading "We're Going on a Bear Hunt" for the 753rd time. Not that Maitland was paying much attention to the story. He knew it inside out, while his wife Fiona took her turn reading pages with an incredulous intensity, like she was discovering the story for the first time. Maitland would rhyme off entire pages without looking. Everything about the story irritated him, something he did a poor job of hiding. Fiona scowled at him, not for his lack of attention, but for the series of staccato vibrations coming from the phone in his trouser pocket. It was the rhythm of someone messaging in anger, smashing "send" after every short sentence. Finally, Fiona broke off from the story to implore Maitland, "Can't you put that on silent?" He seemed to be making a point of not checking his phone, as if he either already knew who it was, or didn't want to know. "Sorry," he mumbled in reply. "Who's texting you so much anyway?" "Sorry," he repeated, stealing a quick glance at who the sender was before shoving his phone back into his pocket. He evaded further by gesturing at the dad figure on the page. "What's with this guy anyway? He takes his whole family out to the countryside, not for a picnic or a nice walk, but to hunt for a fucking bear." Fiona combined a roll of the eyes with a grimace. Maitland didn't have to wait for her to explain. Yet again, about not swearing in front of 5-year-old Jack. "An effing bear, then." He gestured further. "The 3 kids aren't properly dressed for the outdoors. He gets them all to wade chest-high through what must be a freezing river. Then once everyone's soaked to the skin and caked in mud, he takes them into a dark forest and then into the teeth of some Baltic blizzard, which is bad enough, but the dad then continues with his bear-hunting shit." Fiona couldn't be bothered calling him out this time. Meanwhile, Jack's attention had long since drifted from what should have been a peaceful bedtime story, munching his thumb obliviously as Maitland ranted on. "And then, when they actually find a bear, what does he do? He shouts it and tells them they have to run away. The bear then follows them back home, and they end up locked upstairs in the bedroom, hiding under the bed covers, all because this arsehole wanted to go on a bloody bear hunt." He broke off as another 3 vibrations went off. Anticipating Fiona's annoyance, he made a show that he was dealing with it. Jack, used to hearing them bicker in front of him, now had his entire fist in his mouth, bored out of his box. He looked off towards his bedroom window, where late evening sunlight was fighting its way around the edges of a blanket blind that swayed in a slight breeze. The window had been cracked open to try and break the heat. It had been pushing 30 degrees earlier, and even stripping Jack down to a pair of Spider-Man underpants and a white vest, he still felt warm to the touch. Fiona, seeing Maitland's frozen expression, pressed him. "Is everything all right?" She kept staring at him. "Well?" The blood had drained from his face, eyes lingering on the last message that had been sent. "You're about to enter a nightmare unlike anything you've ever experienced. Just remember, you could have stopped this." Maitland simply repeated, "Sorry," then turned his phone off completely. He lifted his hands to demonstrate that the phone had been dealt with properly now, but he couldn't wipe the shaken expression from his face. Fiona knew that something was wrong, and that she would never get the truth out of him. She never did. On the surface, Maitland and Fiona Ferguson had it all. a traditional red sandstone townhouse in Glasgow's sought-after Downhill area. They were both partners in a thriving law firm with offices across the Central Belt and made a small fortune, enough to cover 4 major holidays each year and fill their house with the best of everything. Money wasn't something they had had to think about for a long time. They were the sort of couple that when they shopped online, they filtered their searches by price, high to low. They had 2 cars out front, an Audi TT for Maitland and a white Range Rover for Fiona. Maitland cared about all that stuff, but for Fiona, it was all window dressing compared to the one thing they treasured more than anything: their smart, funny, and miraculously polite 5-year-old son, Jack. With Jack asleep in bed, his covers pushed down towards his feet, Maitland retired to the ensuite bathroom, while Fiona sat up in bed holding open a book but reading none of it. She noted him casually pocketing his phone from the bedside table on the way to the bathroom. His phone was an enigma to her. He always made sure that it was never left in her presence. Unlike Fiona, who was always leaving hers lying around. She didn't even keep a screen lock on. Maitland could scroll through her photos and messages any time, while he guarded his like it had nuclear codes hidden inside. As soon as the bathroom door closed behind him, he paced around in front of the his and hers sinks, contemplating the phone that he'd placed on the edge of the bath. It sat there now like an unexploded bomb he didn't know how to defuse. He leaned over his sink, staring down the plug hole that seemed to have become a metaphor for his life at that moment. He lifted his head to consider himself in the mirror. A handsome reflection stared back. The symmetrical features that had made him attractive to almost every female he'd encountered since his university days. The once chiseled jawline now sagging slightly from a dearth of recent gym visits. His hair grown out to floppy salt and pepper waves. He'd come from a family of wealthy estate agents, but he had far exceeded his parents' success. Plus, he'd gone to Hutchie Grammar, and his name was Maitland. Guys like him, with names like Maitland, didn't tend to end up unemployed buying scratch cards at 10 in the morning. The world, it seemed, had only success in store for Maitland Ferguson. But all that was about to disappear. Chapter 2. Maitland picked up the phone, now able to reply to the text that had left his stomach churning for the last 45 minutes. He had spent most of it in silence beside Fiona on the couch, considering how to respond. All he could think about was the last line of her last message. Just remember, you could have stopped this. Free to scroll through the full savagery of what he'd been sent, his hand started to tremble as he read the earlier messages. If you come home to find a pet bunny boiling in a pot, you'll sigh with relief at it being a good day compared to what I've got cooking for you. You should never have crossed me, Maitland. He swallowed hard. Many people couldn't admit to themselves that they were bad people, but Maitland had long since accepted it about himself. He would take whatever he had coming. He looked away from the mirror and started typing. Whatever you're thinking of doing, do it to me. Please, leave Fiona out of it. He waited for a reply that didn't come at first. He typed on. Karen? 30 seconds passed. He had no idea how long 30 seconds could feel like, until he found himself staring at a phone screen for that long, praying that the woman you've been having an affair with isn't about to detonate your entire life. Karen finally replied with what Maitland had feared most. It's too late. It's already done. He backed away from the sink and looked at the ceiling in despair. He tried to catch his breath. He wanted more than anything to let out a cry, a sob, a wail, something, any kind of release. Fiona called from bed. "Are you nearly done?" He closed his eyes, trying to remove the tension from his vocal cords. "Be right out." Moments earlier, Fiona picked up her phone and texted, "Has he replied yet?" The recipient, Fiona's closest friend Veronica, replied, "Are you sure you want to know?" Veronica worked for a cybersecurity firm and was technically proficient enough to arrange for a SIM card clone that Fiona had put in Maitland's phone a fortnight ago. Since then, the evidence had been stacking up, monitored at Veronica's end where every message and keystroke and screen tap was logged in preparation for the inevitable divorce. "I need to know," Fiona typed. Reluctantly, Veronica shared the mirror of Maitland's phone screen. Now Fiona was seeing everything as if she was standing over his shoulder. She felt sick as she read the exchange from Karen, whoever she was. Fiona could barely move from anger. He was just a matter of 20 feet away, running the tap as if everything was normal behind that door. Betrayal felt somehow much worse when played out in such close proximity. Normally, cheating involved illicit nights in hotels, car park meetups far away from either of the injured parties, travelling, distance. To have it taking place right under Fiona's nose, in the confines of their own bedroom, made it all somehow much worse. She was going to confront him. She had decided. She threw the covers off and swung her feet down off the bed. Then she saw Jack stirring in his bed on the video monitor on our bedside table. It was a reminder that as soon as she confronted Maitland with the truth, it would be the beginning of the end of everything she really cared about. No more lazy breakfasts together listening to Ken Bruce on Radio 2. No more family Christmases or birthday parties. It would be all tense silences and forced levity to make sure Jack didn't suspect that anything was wrong. That was when she felt it. A sudden sharp prick at her ankle, like an insect bite or a wasp sting. She recoiled, pulling her foot up to inspect it. A tiny pinprick of blood appeared under her ankle bone. "What the hell?" she muttered to herself. Her foot felt heavy, like it was filling with sand. It was a struggle to get it back on the floor. Then her vision turned glassy. Feeling her entire motor system faltering, she called out to Maitland. "You nearly done? I don't feel well." "Be right out," he replied again. By the time he emerged, he found his wife hanging off the end of the bed, doubled over, reaching for the floor. A string of drool leaked from her gaping mouth, her eyes rolling around in their sockets. Maitland rushed to her side, pulling her up from under the arms. "Hey, what's wrong? What's happening?" In her head, Fiona explained clearly, but what came out was nothing but a string of vowels. Maitland fumbled with his phone to call 999, only to have the phone spill out of his hand onto the carpet. It wasn't from panic or fright. It was a reaction to the sharp prick now jabbing into his ankle. He yelled out, but was quick to dismiss any thoughts of what the pain was. Fiona was the one in trouble. At least, that was what he thought, until he leaned down to grab his phone and found himself face-planting the carpet, arms stuck by his sides. Fiona lay helplessly on the bed, face turned towards the bedroom door. She was paralyzed, now a mere passenger in her own body. Maitland was headed the same way. His vision was cloudy and quickly turning into dark, the room vignetting from the sides. There was just enough time for him to see the bed covers ruffling above the valance. The mattress shifted slightly from underneath. Then the sight of a hooded figure crawling out from under the bed. Maitland's mouth hung open in horror, his eyes wide with shock and terror. He knew what he was seeing. He just didn't understand how it was happening. The front and back doors had been locked hours ago. His brain was still operating on some basic survival mode and realized that they must have been under the bed for hours. A stranger, hiding, waiting, listening. Now they had made their move. Maitland groaned as he managed the last few inches of movement from his body. He was now prone on the carpet, face turned towards the bedroom door where the hooded figure was now moving. Fiona was still able to lift her head off the mattress. She had no concern for her own well-being or survival. She had only one thought now. Jack. Her eyelids fluttered at the thought of him, finding some deeply embedded strength that allowed her to shift a leg, then to push herself forward across the bed. The hooded figure stopped and looked back at her. He smiled. The terror of the moment gave Fiona a jolt of adrenaline. Although nothing came out, inside she was screaming. Louder than she'd ever screamed in her life. Because the hooded figure was making his way out of the bedroom, across the hall, opening the door to Jack's room. Fiona found another gear and crawled across the room at a snail's pace. Her eyes were the size of planets, eyeballs throbbing at the thought of harm coming to her only child. Through gritted teeth, leaving a long string of drool behind, she grunted and snarled all the way across the bed, falling to the carpet on the other side. Now, there was only smooth wooden flooring between her and the intruder. She wasn't going down without a fight. Through her snarls, she heard some kind of incantation coming from Jack's room. A song? A nursery rhyme? The hooded man emerged, cradling Jack in his arms. He was singing him a lullaby. Fiona's entire body came out in goosebumps. She could tell from Jack's expression that he wasn't sleeping. He had been knocked out, his head dangling over the man's forearm. The man wore black from head to toe, a balaclava underneath his hoodie, then piercing out, 2 bright white eyes. His balaclava lifted slightly from the upwards motion of his cheekbones as he smiled. He stopped in the hall to take in the desperate sight of Fiona. His voice was soft, unthreatening. Don't worry. You'll be safe, like the others. He stepped over her and opened the front door. Fiona willed herself to grab his leg, to call Jack's name. Neither of these things happened. The man casually exited the house. Fiona caught one last sight of Jack's face, his expression frozen. In vain she tried to yell her husband's name, for him to do something, to stop it. But Maitland couldn't do or say anything. Like Fiona, all he could do was watch as his son was taken away. Chapter 3. Detective Chief Inspector John Lomond closed his front door behind him, taking in the sight of his tiny, dismal flat, before dropping his suit jacket on top of a pile of unopened junk mail and takeaway menus. He hadn't needed the jacket since leaving at 5:30 that morning. The arms and chest were heavily creased from carrying it scrunched in his hand all day like a cheap bunch of petrol station flowers, taken from car to office to Greg's to office to home again. He cursed the infernal summer heat. After all, it was Scotland in July. It wasn't as if summer was an actual thing there. Summer was something that only ever happened down south. Anytime the news reported heat waves showing hordes of beachgoers sunburnt by lunchtime on English beaches, The BBC would report it as if it was happening everywhere. Meanwhile, it would invariably be tipping it down all across the Central Belt. But for once, Glasgow was in the middle of a heatwave that was now in its 7th day. Like any senior officer who had put in time at many stations through the years, Lomond had acquired a number of nicknames. While at London Road Station working for major investigations, he was known simply as Big Yin, on account of his 6'3" frame, as well as Lurch and Bigfoot. One of the more literary-minded sergeants had christened him the Long Dark, also because of his height, and his often broodingly dark personality. His wife, Ailey, had often remarked that his inability to make nice chat at work drinks or functions was the main reason he had languished at Chief Inspector level for so long, while much less talented officers than him had climbed the greasy ladder at Police Scotland's Dalmarnock headquarters. When in the company of fellow police, all Lomond wanted to do was talk about inquiries, and no one ever talked about inquiries at work functions. They talked about football or TV, or who might be secretly shagging who. Those senior officers in Dalmarnock were there because they had a talent for talking about themselves, always lobbying. The only lobbying Lomond had ever done was for increasing prison sentences on murderers, rapists, and paedophiles. Lomond sighed as he entered the living room. You little arseholes. He had left the windows open all day, and now 3 serious-looking wasps were having a major scrap in the middle of the room. Getting them out required a feat of coordination, for as soon as he had cajoled one of them out by flapping a small cushion, another had come buzzing back in. Getting them all out took up another 15 minutes of his time, and left him sweating even more than before. After a cold shower, he returned to the living room wrapped in a towel, refreshed and chilled. The room was sparsely furnished. Books on forensic science, Scots law, and true crime were piled in loose stacks on the floor. Judging on furniture alone, a stranger might have surmised that Lomond had just moved in, or was on the cusp of leaving. There was a TV stand in the corner that the previous tenant had left, but Lomond hadn't brought a TV with him. He hadn't had one for years. In the place of a TV was a hi-fi and turntable. Currently playing was The Blue Nile's The Downtown Lights. He hadn't exactly pushed the boat out when it came to decoration. He was renting, rather than paying a mortgage. He might have been earning over 60 grand a year, but his move to Paisley was only supposed to be temporary. It had seemed pointless buying somewhere in Scotland's biggest town, which was another way of saying it was close to being Scotland's smallest city. Resale in Paisley could be a nightmare, and Lomond had no intention of acquiring a financial anchor in Paisley. Renting made more sense. That was 5 years ago. Since then, he had covered the plain magnolia walls with newspaper clippings, police records, witness statements, various maps of Glasgow, and suspect mugshots. At the centre were 5 young faces, all of them under 10 years old. The youngest was 4. Their eyes glowed with innocence, gap-toothed grins and rosy cheeks, school ties knotted clumsily and pulled aside for official primary school photographs. They had started as the missing. Then they were the dead. And, finally, christened by a Glasgow Express reporter as the Bonnie Dead. The headline had been pinned to the centre of the wall. For Lomond, those 5 faces were what it was all about now. Justice. The truth. He changed into jeans and a t-shirt. Then he opened up the hall cupboard, which was completely rammed. As soon as the door opened, a Tetris construction of different-sized boxes tumbled out towards him. Among them was a collection of flat-pack boxes for a baby crib, a pram, a baby playmat, a slightly used car seat, whose box was the size of a Fiat 500, and the coffin-like baby box sent to every new parent in Scotland containing dozens of essential items and clothes. Hands on hips, Lomond surveyed the mess. He'd put the job off long enough. He took the boxes one by one to the living room. With the boxes arranged next to the sofa, he changed the vinyl playing to the Beatles' Abbey Road, then opened up eBay on his laptop and set about the laborious task of listing the items one by one. Instead of auctions, he chose Buy It Now and selected prices far below the suggested. He wasn't interested in maximising profits. He just wanted shot of it all as quickly as possible. They had all followed him from his previous flat in the West End of Glasgow. Some items, like the car seat, had since been superseded by newer models, but such were the rip-off prices of baby gear, he would still be able to get close to the original cost back, particularly as none of the items had been used. As George Harrison's twangy guitar opening to Something came on, Lomond found himself thinking of Ernest Hemingway, and the possibly apocryphal tale of his penning a short story that consisted of just 6 words. For sale. Baby shoes. Never worn. Lomond had said much the same in his eBay listings. Brand new, never used, no time wasters. When he was done with the listings, the Beatles album had reached the closing medley, beginning with the plaintive piano of Golden Slumbers. He sat back in the sofa in relief and closed his eyes. Lomond wasn't the crying kind, but something about how the evening sky looked from his second-floor window, a radiant orange and burnt umber, and the weight of what he had been carrying for 5 years now, washed over him as fresh as he had felt for a long time. He had started the process of saying goodbye, getting rid of the last traces of his expectant fatherhood, and even now, he wasn't sure that he was ready to let go. There was no time to wallow. The day job might have been over. His current case, a tedious investigation into a till operator who had been skimming from a local supermarket. But he was still a DCI. He wasn't done with work yet, not by a long shot. He cleared the living room of the boxes and set about doing what had become his nightly ritual, unloading boxes of evidence and reading. Lots and lots of reading. All of it on the same case. The case that had loomed larger in his career than any other. The Sandman. Chapter 4. The name had come about when it emerged that the killer was leaving piles of sand in the eyes of his young victims, and in the beds he had taken them from. The details had been kept under wraps upon the discovery of the first victim, Kieran McPhee, who had been snatched from his bed in a tiny semi-detached house in Postle Park in the middle of the night, while his parents attended a house party next door. They had only left the party when the police appeared after a complaint about hours of pounding trance music and reports of arguing and fights in the street outside. When Kieran's mum checked on him, she found his bed empty and the covers pulled back. Where her son should have been sleeping was now a small pile of sand. The sand had baffled the local CID, who investigated the disappearance. They found Kieran's body 5 days later, lying in reeds at the edge of the canal near the Postle Road aqueduct. Sand covered 6-year-old Kieran's eyes. The hysteria around the killings really started 7 months later around the discovery of the second victim, Leanne Donnelly. Lomond and the major investigations team that were working the case had tried desperately to keep the sand part out of the papers. But the dog walker who had found Leanne's body at dawn in the middle of Paisley's old racecourse, a field of a dozen football pitches next to the M8 flyover near Glasgow Airport, had spoken to the press, and Lomond couldn't hold back the tide any longer. The press revelled in the strange detail, which elevated an already tragic serial killing to something almost mythological. What did this killer want? What did it mean? The children were snatched from their homes, mostly in deprived areas, until the third victim, Blair Forbes, who was taken from a comfortable suburban street of expensive villas in Mount Vernon. Then it became clear. No one was safe. The children were kept alive, but drugged heavily with a paralyzing agent. Then 5 days later, their bodies dumped. The papers needed a name, a catchy title to hang their speculation on. The Glasgow Express's Colin Mowat had been first to print with the name after hearing it from a young detective sergeant from the Helen Street station in Govan, where the major investigation team was based. Mowat knew that the name would stick. And it did. The Express outsold their rivals 2-1 the day they ran the front page headline, "Sandman Killer Strikes Again." Once the moniker had gained traction, morbid speculation grew to fever pitch after the third victim was found. It was undeniable proof that a serial killer was at large. 2 near-identical murders of children between the ages of 5 and 7, found in the same way, dumped in a public place with piles of sand on their eyes. There seemed to be no pattern to when the killer would strike. Sometimes there were months between murders, or in the case of victims 3 and 4, a year and a half. Regardless, parents weren't willing to take any chances. Some took it in shifts to stay up all night, watching their children sleep from a chair in the corner of the room, with various weapons for defense sitting by their feet. The discovery of victims 3 and 4 marked the apex of Sandman hysteria. Years later, it was easy to forget how intense it had all been at the time, how scared the public was, for their own children, their nieces and nephews, family friends, neighbours. Despite the commonality of victims being taken from their beds, the terror of abduction carried over into the daytime. Any instance of a lone child spotted walking the streets, people watched over them from their living room windows, waiting for any sign that someone might be coming for them. It led to a rash of strangers approaching children, offering them company home to keep them safe. One man had ended up beaten to a pulp after word spread around an estate that he'd attempted to drag a child into his car. It later emerged that he was simply the child's parent, who'd been attempting to control an unruly 8-year-old who had been refusing to get into the car for a dentist appointment. There were similar stories across the city. On buses and trains and the subway, it was all people talked about and read about, and wrote about on social media. One paper christened it Sandmania. Any child under 10 who went missing and wasn't found within hours was instantly feared to be the next victim, regardless of whether there were any traits of a Sandman abduction. Parents of the missing resigned themselves to fate by as early as day 2, hope abandoned, awaiting the inevitable discovery of a body come day 5. The pattern grimly familiar and predictable. Yet despite the safeguards, the massive police presence scouring the streets at night for lone males, residents locking their windows and installing motion detector alarms, still more victims fell. Colin Mowat was the first major reporter to publicly criticise the police investigation. What had started as full support and cooperation from the public soon shifted when third victim Blair Forbes was found in a tenement back garden next to the rubbish bins. Constables faced outright hostility on their beat, the public's ire directed at the uniformed cops who were there to keep them safe. Doing the thankless, working round the clock, for little fanfare. The days between the abduction and the discovery of the body were the worst. Shouts would ring out in a crowded Sauchiehall street. "The Sandman's no here. Forget about shoplifters and go find that missing Wayne." There always seemed to be some blow-up or confrontation over what was happening, when tragedy now seemed a lot more like incompetence, which wasn't helped by certain officers leaking unintentionally misleading information that had been passed from station to station, until the whispers turned the truth inside out. Rumours spread through communities about anyone who didn't fit in, who kept to themselves, who just didn't seem right. By the time victim 4, Mark Whitehouse, was found, the word had come down from Mordor, aka Police Scotland headquarters in Kilmarnock, that the case was to be controlled from there. Lomond would be the face of things at major investigations, but Kilmarnock was running the show now. Lomond took the blame for the lack of transparency with his own team, having to lock them out of certain details to stop any further leaks, which only alienated him further from his team, who gossiped that Lomond had purposely shut them out as a means of glory hunting and beefing up his public persona, which couldn't have been further from the truth. It was impossible to run an investigation under such conditions. Kilmarnock seemed more concerned about bad PR than another dead child. It was no longer just a murder case. It was damage control for the police's image. Every year brought the same media circus, and Lomond had become the face of it, reduced to a mouthpiece for his superiors. Until the night that everything changed for Lomond. 5 years ago. A night he would never forget, and after which nothing could ever be the same again. Chapter 5. He kept a column of faces and names of possible suspects that covered the living room wall almost from floor to ceiling. Night after night, he carried out deep dives on every single one, refusing to move on and place them in the column of cleared suspects until he was satisfied beyond all doubt that they were innocent. He had prison records for every suspect that fit the profile of their killer. Crimes against children, paedophilia. No suspects whose crimes had involved random spontaneous violence. That wasn't their guy. The Sandman didn't do spontaneous or lack of control. Lomond had never encountered a more disciplined killer in his career. Few had. One name at a time, Lomond cross-referenced against his old suspect list. Every name that ever came up in anonymous phone tips or was ever mentioned in a witness statement and door-to-doors. Absolutely no one was ruled out unless it was certain. By year 3, Lomond had a list of 312 names that had all been ruled out. Now, he was going back through them all from the start. He was sure of it. Somewhere, someone had messed up, missed something. A killer like the Sandman must have thrown up a red flag to someone through the years. Normal people kill all the time, but they never did it quite like the Sandman. Sometimes it took hours, sometimes days or weeks to clear a name. He did it all in his spare time, now that the Sandman case had been passed on to another DCI. As far as they were concerned, the case was colder than the River Clyde in a winter morning. Like the city at large, by the 3rd year of no murders, the police thought it might be all over. And it was in Glasgow's nature to move on. People forgot how scared they had once been. Children grew up, getting too old to be likely victims. Memories fade, like when terror attacks happened. There was blanket coverage for a week. Then when the headlines stop and something bigger or more urgent takes over, people forget. But not John Lomond. He couldn't forget those faces. What those children had looked like in person at the crime scenes. That awful sand piled over their eyes, covering where such beauty and innocence had once glowed. The 4th year without any further murders brought speculation that maybe the killer had died, or been imprisoned for some other crime, no longer free to continue their twisted, demonic work. Life returned to normal. Parents slept in their own beds again. Playgrounds were full. Children roamed freely with balls and bikes, fearing nothing and no one. The Sandman was something horrible that had happened to other children, and now he was gone. By the 3rd true crime book on the subject, public appetite for Sandman material waned. Everyone wanted to move on. John Lomond didn't have that luxury. What he had were failed promises to grieving parents. Promises to find the bastard who had killed their children and lock him away forever. To make sure that no one else ever suffered the cruel fate of those 5 bonny kids. When everyone else could look away from the horror, he stuck with it. Because it was in his nature, his programming, that he couldn't turn away and move on. Lomond's superiors and the senior officers still dipping their toes into the cold cases of the Sandman killings thought it was over because they wanted it to be. It was more comfortable for them to believe that. They wanted to live in a world where people like the Sandman didn't exist. But Lomond knew that a killer like that couldn't just stop. It wasn't over. Lomond counted down the time to midnight, the same way he always did, in quiet contemplation, with a healthy dram in his hand, standing in front of the wall of evidence that dominated the living room. He checked his watch again. Nearly there. Nearly another day safely gone. That was the only consolation, that at least no other child had died at the Sandman's hands. It was still impossibly hot for the late hour. Lomond wiped away a layer of sweat on his upper lip before taking another sip of whiskey. He ran his hand over his completely shaved head. At the first slight sign of thinning hair at age 32, he'd gone to town on his scalp with a No. 1 clipper blade, a cut that he performed weekly. It made him look older than his 43 years, but appearances were not terribly important to him. Although he had noted with concern his growing paunch, how much noise he made getting up off the sofa, and the alarming rate at which his nose hair was growing. He had on a live version of Summertime by Ella Fitzgerald on YouTube, recorded in Berlin in 1968. Gone was the studio version's familiar hazy mood and lush strings, replaced by a brooding jazz quartet that played the song at half speed. Rather than the studio version's romanticism, Ella's voice was now that of love lost for good. The perfect soundtrack to a heatwave at night. Lomond had heard it dozens of times, but it still found ways to surprise him. Every note meant something to Ella, deep in her bones. The camera showed Ella dabbing sweat gently from her neck, crooning softly before launching into a sudden change of pitch, a stunning vibrato that appeared like a bolt of lightning that was so powerful it made the pianist behind her visibly jump on his stool. The moment gave Lomond goosebumps. He went to the window, looking down on the street. A lone Ned stalked along, buzzing from the bottle of Bucky in his hand, still shirtless from earlier in the day. His back and shoulders were scorched neon pink with sunburn. At each passing car he unleashed a volley of abuse. About what was unclear. It was no mystery to Lomond how someone could be so angry at everything. He had encountered so many lives that had been chaotic from birth. All that mattered to them as young adults was getting as wasted as often as possible. They had seen and heard things by primary school age that most adults couldn't even imagine. Years on the street had taught Lomond to always see the core of who they would have been as children. No one was born bad, were they? What always stumped Lomond, though, was the Sandman. How could someone become so evil? What made a person want to do those things to children? What explained that? What explained evil? He checked the time again. Only another 3 minutes had gone. It was so close to another day without incident. He woke up his phone to check his messages. What friends he had at Helen Street promised to keep him in the loop if any murders had been called in for the division. They owed him that much at least, to keep him informed. At 2 minutes to midnight, Lomond turned the music off. He took a seat on the sofa, watching time tick by on his phone. He even allowed himself the thought that everyone else was right. The Sandman was gone for good. He might not have been caught. He might have got away with it. But bad people got away with terrible things all the time. Lomond knew that all too well. He also had instincts. And instinct told him 5 years ago that the Sandman wouldn't stop. Not until he was caught. They weren't satisfying some wild bloodlust. It meant far more to them than that, which meant that they wouldn't stop without a reason. Lomond's phone screen lit up. The ringtone cut through the silence of the room, giving his heart rate a jolt. The ID said, Linda Boyle. Detective Superintendent Linda Boyle. Lomond held the phone out, dreading what she would have to say. He no longer worked under Boyle, so any call at such a time could only be bad news. He answered. Linda? There was a pause. As soon as he realized she was outside somewhere, he knew what had happened. She said, You were right. It's happening again. Chapter 6. Lomond was in his car 10 minutes later, ripping up the short drive from Paisley on the M8 to the Clyde Tunnel, then across the West End to the leafy streets of Downhill. He felt strange being back there. He had tried to avoid the area whenever necessary, reminding him of a time in his life that had long since passed. Finding the Ferguson residence among the winding, rolling streets didn't take long. It was in Kensington Gate, among an S-shaped terrace of red sandstone houses, which were currently illuminated by blue flashing lights from multiple parked police cars. An hour earlier, there had also been the lights of 2 ambulances that had since sped away to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, carrying Maitland and Fiona Ferguson, who were both paralysed and incapable of speech. Most of the neighbouring windows were occupied with residents who had been woken by the sirens and lights. It was the biggest event to happen there since the pre-summer clean-up in the communal garden. The contents of Kensington Gate homes might have appealed to burglars, but their one-way in, one-way out main front doors did not. The residents' WhatsApp group was lighting up with messages every minute as fears grew for little Jack Ferguson. His parents had been spotted on stretchers, but there had been no sign of the child anywhere. Constables and detectives were canvassing the neighbours, but so far no one had seen anything. Everyone had been in bed or watching TV. There had been no audible disturbances, crashes or bangs. Nothing suspicious at all. Lomond showed his ID lanyard and gave a purse of his lips to the constable dutifully guarding the cordon at the end of the Fergusons' front garden. The constable recognised Lomond's face, but couldn't quite place him or his name. He knew that he'd heard it around the station, though. While Lomond inspected the soil in the front garden, he asked the constable, "Superintendent Boyle." The constable leaned back to see towards the hallway, through the open front door, around which several large moths were buzzing around the white exterior security light. "Last I saw she was downstairs, sir." Without a word, Lomond handed him a bottle of water. He had spent many lonely nights on cordons in his career, and knew that a little professional courtesy went a long way for a constable on a hot night in uniform. DCIs and DSs got all the glory in the press, but constables did all the really hard work, pounding the pavement, out in response, kicking in doors, and a ton of specialisms that often left them better qualified for certain roles than the officers in charge of them. Once Lomond was inside, a young detective sergeant who had been trying to listen in from a few doors down approached the constable. He flicked his chin up. "What does he want?" The constable shrugged innocently. "Said he wanted the super." "You know who he is, right?" the sergeant asked, desperate to show off his insider knowledge, to show that he was important enough to know gossip about a chief inspector. The constable had met a few junior detectives like him already in his brief career. They were as much in love with the idea of pouncing about looking important in plain clothes as they were getting the job done. The constable let the sergeant go through his little routine anyway. "I've never seen him." "God, you are new," said the sergeant. "That's John Lomond." "Yeah, I did actually look at the badge he showed me." "The badge doesn't tell you he ran the Sandman case for a while." "Why was he taken off?" "I never found out. The press had been caning their arse for close to 5 years already. They used to say Lomond was on his way to Linda Boyle's position now. Had to take 6 months leave, and when he came back he was sent to Mill Street. Couldn't hack it in the city anymore." The constable looked clueless. "Mill Street?" "The main station in Paisley," the sergeant said. "Massive grey 70s monstrosity. Looks like something out of East Germany." "Is going to Mill Street really that bad?" "After heading up Glasgow MIT, that's like going from number 9 at Real Madrid to sub-goalie at Cowdenbeath." The constable considered this, then pushed out his lips. "Don't really follow football." Dissatisfied at the response, the sergeant set off towards the next door to chap. Lomond set off through the front garden, observing 2 senior officers in the hallway. The woman was Detective Superintendent Linda Boyle. The male, who was making a hasty exit at the sight of the approaching Lomond, was Chief Superintendent Alistair Reekie of G Division, Greater Glasgow. Like most senior officers, Reekie had a nickname he knew nothing about, passed about from station to station. It started the same way it had for Reekie in primary school. Even a small child's limited vocabulary could get them to reek from Reekie, then from reek to smell, from smell to shit, then from shit to shithead. Not exactly Oscar Wilde, but as far as accuracy went, it was spot on. And what had been good enough in the playground to taunt a short, bespectacled Reekie was more than good enough for the constables and sergeants of Police Scotland that Reekie had pissed off. And there were plenty of them. In another life, Reekie might have been a bishop in the church, the sort who loved nothing more than putting on the fancy purple robe and the jewellery and ornaments. As Reekie passed Lomond on the concrete slabs, he said simply and without eye contact, "John?" Lomond had to remind himself not to say, "Arsehole." Shithead, arsehole, or sometimes the grand arsehole. When it came to Reekie, imagination wasn't as important as capturing the sheer contempt that everyone in the force had for him. And sometimes, the simplest was the best. Lomond said, "Sir." He looked over his shoulder and noted Reekie going out of his way to greet a young detective sergeant, the same one who had gossiped with the constable at the cordon. Boyle greeted Lomond at the front door and said to him with typical sarcasm, "You took your time. What, were you parked around the corner?" He replied, "The motorway wasn't exactly busy." He motioned at Riki driving off in his Porsche 4x4. "What's the grand arsehole doing here?" "He's shitting it, isn't he? That it's starting again on his watch." "He seemed pleased to see me. He didn't plunge a knife into my back or anything, so I must be on the up and up. What have we got?" So far, all he knew was that a boy aged 5 had been abducted from his home and the parents had been rushed to hospital. Boyle said, "Same as the others, mostly. Home invasion. Looks like the boy was snatched from his bed." "Sand?" "In the bed." "Shit. Why do you say mostly the same?" "Parents were found passed out on the floor. They'd been drugged." "That's different. I mean, we know the children in the past were drugged, but never anything with the parents." "They're still KO'd. Only faint feeling in their limbs and neither of them can talk. The doctors say it's some kind of paralysis agent." Lomond squinted. Why the parents? He wondered aloud. Why something new? Boyle said, "You don't need me to tell you that this might not be our guy. I wanted your opinion anyway. I don't want to take any chances." "So he drugs them to get to the kid," Lomond said to himself. "How did he manage to drug the pair of them? Our guy doesn't do physical confrontation. Now he's taken on 2 adults in a house he's unfamiliar with." "That's not all," said Boyle. "He didn't fully knock them out." "What do you mean?" Boyle indicated the constable watching the cordon outside, the first officer at the scene. "The FOS said that the parents were wide awake, but they couldn't move or speak. Totally paralysed from the neck down. The doctor reckons they might have been conscious through the whole thing." Lomond wondered aloud. If drugging is purely to make taking the kid easier, why not knock them out altogether? Better yet, why not just hit them over the head with something, faffing around with needles? Boyle waited for him to complete his thought. "This one wasn't just about taking the kid," he said. "He wanted them to see the kid being taken. It was about making the parents feel powerless." He shook his head, trying to see past the details that confirmed what he was already thinking. He clicked his tongue rapidly, assessing the totality of what they were looking at. "We've never seen any evidence that our guy cares about that." "Go on," said Boyle. "It's a change in pattern." "I know how much they drive you crazy." The corner of Lomond's mouth turned up slightly in appreciation. Quoting one of his mentors, he said, "Changes can't be ignored because they're inconvenient to your theory. And this drugging is definitely inconvenient." Boyle led the way to the kitchen at the rear of the property, pointing out a door still locked from the inside. "I'll tell you what else is inconvenient. The kidnapper was already in the house when the alarm was tripped. Both external doors, front and back, were locked." Lomond said, "No sign of tampering." "The alarm company said Maitland Ferguson entered his PIN at 8:15 tonight. The alarm was tripped at 10:42 at the front door. The suspect used the key and walked straight out the front door with the kid, then locked the door behind him." Lomond nodded, slowly. The break in conversation allowed him to take in as much of the plush surroundings as possible as they returned to the hall. He undid the top button of his shirt and loosened his tie a shade. How can it possibly still be so hot this late at night? He thought. He said. He was calm. Didn't panic and break the door down. Took the time to find the house keys. Lomond was distracted as the detective sergeant from outside called out from the garden path. It's not him. He doesn't do risk or complication. His snatches are clean, out of sight. He doesn't take the time required to research a job, a family like this. And he doesn't take the risks necessary to pull something like this off. Feels too... He searched for the right word. Personal. He swaggered over, dripping with attitude. Everything about him said, I reckon I'm destined for big things. He was on the short side, tall enough not to worry about height restrictions at fairgrounds, but nowhere near troubling 6 foot, and was wearing a matching tweed waistcoat and trousers, having discarded the jacket on account of the heat. His white shirt was a size too small for him to accentuate his physique, though he wasn't nearly as muscly as he thought, and his hair was pushed back and long on top, and shaved at the sides into a classic undercut. Lomond wasn't sure if he was looking at Polis or someone about to go clubbing with the lads. Boyle introduced him. John, this is D.S. Ross McNair. Ross, John Lomond, Paisley CID. Lomond smirked. He'd met plenty like D.S. McNair in his time. Under 10 years in and thought they knew it all. Oh, Peaky Blinders. You got a license for that swagger? He asked. Boyle stifled a laugh. His air of superiority punctured. McNair produced an evidence bag containing a mobile phone. The paramedics found this on the bedroom floor. Lomond switched it on, pressing the side buttons through the bag. How did we get the call in the first place? Boyle answered. The alarm company got an auto-response when the front door was stripped. Lomond pondered the numerous sensors hooked up wirelessly around the property. What is it? Lomond said. It's pretty serious security, even for a West End pad. Allow me, said Ross, taking the phone from Lomond. He opened the alarm app, bringing up camera footage from the front door. Watch this. It showed a hooded figure, unmistakably male, carrying a small body out the front door through the garden. I suppose it's too much to ask for any images of a car or a van driving away, asked Lomond. Yep, Ross said. Far too much. He just walks out of view to the left. There's an alley around the side under some trees. He probably parked there. It's only used for bin collection lorries. The residents park at the front. He tapped out of the app and opened the messages. I was wondering if you think that maybe this warrants further investigation. He held the screen up to Lomond, showing the last message received. You're about to enter a nightmare unlike anything you've ever experienced. Just remember, you could have stopped this. Lomond pointed at the sender's phone number. Who is this delightful ray of sunshine? Ross replied. It's a burner, so it's going to take some time. We're working on it. What about the neighbours? No one saw or heard anything unusual. What about no one suspicious seen walking around in the last week? I've spoken to all 24 households with eyes on the front door. Surprised and impressed, Boyle said, You've spoken to 24 already? Ross said, Yeah, I mean, first hours are crucial, right? Lomond kept wandering the property, looking for the one detail that didn't look right. Detective work's a marathon, not a sprint, Ross. You race through witnesses that fast, you might miss something. Not appreciating the unsolicited guidance in showing the first signs of irritation, Ross turned to Boyle. Sorry, am I missing something? Shouldn't DCI Sutherland be hearing this too? Because, with respect, he gestured to Lomond, this is a Glasgow MIT job, not Paisley CID. If Lomond's closest pal on the force and a senior officer hadn't been standing there, he might have considered laying the cheeky bastard out. Being on friendly terms with the CSU had given the young DS an inflated sense of where he was on the ladder of Police Scotland's rank. Boyle said, "John's given us some perspective on what we're dealing with." Ross replied, "I can help you with your perspective, DCI Lomond. It's not your cereal. I don't care about that pile of sand in the bed." "Are there any other facts you'd like to ignore?" Lomond asked. "I'm not ignoring them. I'm disqualifying them. There's a difference. I think someone's gone to lengths to make us think this is the Sandman." "You think the mystery woman on the phone is behind it?" "Using publicly available details about a serial killer is a good way of hiding your work." Paul deferred to Lomond. "It's possible," Lomond conceded. Ross added, "I know a lot of this isn't the Sandman's style, so we also can't discount the possibility of a copycat." Lomond's body language did a good job of displaying exactly what he thought of Ross's idea. "Someone who goes to the trouble required to make this sort of scene isn't interested in being a copycat. This person's got something to say, and we should listen, even if that might be uncomfortable for you, Detective Sergeant. But even if this isn't him, our chances of finding Little Jack alive after the first week dropped to about 7%. 75% of abducted children are murdered within 3 hours of abduction." Lomond checked his watch, then held it up to Ross. "We're currently 15 minutes out from 3 hours. Chapter 7. To emphasize the urgency, Boyle said, "We've got until dawn to build something promising before the media descends on us. We need something, anything. An eyewitness, a car plate, CCTV dashcam footage, something we can investigate and chase down." Lomond looked out to the street with concern as a souped-up Ford Focus rumbled into the parking space vacated by CSU Reiki. "Oh, for..." Boyle craned her neck to see who it was. "Who is that?" Lomond puffed. "Call him bloody Mowat." "How the hell are the press getting wind of this already?" asked Ross. Boyle gestured at the abundance of windows snaking around the street, all with a clear view of the police presence. "We're not exactly running incognito here," Lomond warned. "If Mowat's here, he knows something bigger than an average burglary is up." Boyle called to the constable by the cordon. "Get rid of him." A baby-faced 30-year-old man with floppy red hair and bright freckles dashed around the front of his car and threw his hands up in the air in defeat. "Oh, come on! I'm a good half hour ahead of the pack on this one." Getting as close as he could to the cordon, he called out, "John, is it happening again? Is he back?" Lomond wouldn't even look at the bastard. "Ah, it's Ron Weasley. I see you never bothered your arse to use that gift voucher I got you for Dignitas. Shame that." "Ah, it's Ron Weasley. I see you never bothered your arse to use that gift voucher I got you for Dignitas. Shame that." He took out his notepad. "Can the Glasgow Express quote you on that?" Lomond was held back by Linda, and out of professional loyalty, Ross. Lomond started to wriggle out of his suit jacket. He seethed. "You can quote me on this, Christopher fucking Robin." He made a sudden move towards Mowat. Boyle and Ross wrestled him away, while 2 other constables ran over to keep Mowat back. "Let's not do that," Boyle warned Lomond, leading him back into the house. "Prick!" he spat, his blood still up. Boyle told Ross, "Get into Dalmarnock about that phone. Maitland Ferguson could be under for another 6 hours, and we need to know who he was messaging earlier." As Ross disappeared into the back of the house, phone clamped to his ear, Lomond managed to calm down. "What's his story?" "DS McNair." "Hang on, let me guess." It only took him a moment. Took the sergeant exam as soon as he could. Now he's working towards organised crime.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.